Hey folks, Michael Mann with Michael Mann Security Services. We're going to talk about preventive security measures for houses of worship. All right, folks, if you want to get a hold of us, you can get me at contact@michaelmannsecurityservices.com. You can always call me at 615-956-3912. And if I don't answer, just leave me a message and I'll get back with you shortly. Okay, folks, here's the agenda for this short webinar. We're going to talk about securing houses of worship, a threat assessment. So before we start talking about preventative measures, what I do want to just talk about is just like what is the threat to churches and what does that look like? We're going to talk about physical security assessments, categories of violence, warning signs and indicators, and behavior threat detection or preventing the act of assailant. So we're going to talk about those things together. I'm going to get into the role of law enforcement security and houses of worship. And then, of course, I'm going to get into the development and safety or the development use of safety and security teams and what that looks like. Okay, so let's get into it. So what is the threat assessment? What does the threat look like for churches? How do we do this? And so what I want to understand before I start looking at preventive measures and planning is, man, what am I facing here? Because that's always the first step. So the threat assessment, just understand in any asset that we're trying to protect, or asset being something that has a positive value to us, and here we're talking about a house of worship. There are different threat categories, and in general there are three. There are those that are natural, which is like weather-related stuff, and here in Middle Tennessee we have to deal with those kind of threats throughout the year with thunderstorms, ice in the wintertime, flooding, heat, you name it. We have natural threats here in Tennessee, and no matter where you're joining us from, you probably have those same issues. And believe it or not, you need to deal with those. From a church security perspective and for safety, those need to be addressed as threats. You need to look at those. Then there are the intentional threats. Intentional threats are the things that we worry most about most of the majority of the time. So these are things like active assailants, crime-related incidents. And so those are the things that are always on the forefront of the threat assessment. We do need to pay attention to those. Most of our security program or planning is going to address the intentional threats, but just understand that the most likely threat is probably not going to be intentional, okay? And then we have unintentional threats. And the unintentional is probably the most likely. These are things that are hard to plan for, and those are things like medical emergencies, slips, trips, and falls. Believe it or not, one of the leading causes of death in the United States of America is not an active assailant, but it actually is some sort of an accident. And these fall accidents and these slips, trips, and falls, medical emergencies, they fall into the unintentional threat category. Now, the majority of this webinar is going to talk about the intentional threat, but just understand when we start talking about doing threat assessments, what are we addressing? The most likely threat is going to be that unintentional, even though we want to address all three, okay? Now, when we start talking about intentional threats like attacks, and we start talking about vulnerabilities in churches, I see a lot of information out there. Some of it I think is almost designed to scare folks into doing things. And so that's not what this presentation is about. But I do want to get into, when we start talking about threats, we want to talk about like a vulnerability, like why do they occur? What are our opportunities? And so we do need to look at the vulnerabilities in churches today. When attacks occur, what's happening? What is the church not doing? And what is it that might have left them vulnerable? So number one is what I see is just a lack of security planning. Church security is pretty new. About 10 years ago, we started to see it grow with the use of volunteers. So security planning is new to a lot of churches. A lot of churches don't have a security planner or someone that's a security professional, that's trained, certified, educated in security. A lot of times because it's a volunteer, whoever's going to volunteer needs to put up or come up with a security plan and implement that. So a lot of times there's a lack of security planning, or there just isn't somebody that understands how to do that. Number two is a lack of a layered approach. And we're going to get into this in the violence piece of it. And the layered approach means that we've got observation or some sort of detection and the ability to address and respond to something early. And that layered approach means we need to have people or some sort of method of detection at different layers of the church. There's an outer layer, there's a middle layer, and there's an inner layer. You guys can go on the website, watch the other videos about physical security, and it goes into the layered approach much more. Threat identification, we need to understand what these threats, especially these intended threats, look like. What does that mean? Like, what is it? Are these intentional threats? What does it look like? What's the threat look like before? How do we address it? Do we need to report these things? How do we go up and try to validate this? And again, we're going to get into this in the violence piece of this webinar. And so threat identification, there's usually a lack thereof. And so churches a lot of times in these events are responding to the attack. They don't have the ability to address this early and prevent it. Observing and reporting, without a layered approach, it's really hard to detect things early and observe them and then report them and be able to prevent them. A lot I see with churches, a lot of response and mitigation. So observing and reporting is something that is also lacking, or there's an opportunity for that. And a lot of that just got to do with basic security planning. If you don't have a security professional that's done this and educated, trained, certified in it, maybe they just don't understand that. And there's always a focus on something else. And then this kind of gets into this kind of captures what this webinar is about. What is the focus? Is the focus in church security at your house of worship? Is it on preventing things from occurring, or is it all about response? Nothing wrong with response, nothing wrong with volunteers that are armed, that are there to respond to some sort of a threat or provide an immediate response. And we're going to get into that shortly. But just understand, in security, specifically in churches, we're trying to prevent something from occurring so we don't have to respond to it. And that goes into what we see early, how we address it, and understanding what that looks like. Okay, so that is the threat assessment piece. As we start to understand preventative measures, we need to understand what the threat is and understand why attacks are happening and the things that we can do to prevent them from occurring. So security assessment is the first part of a preventative measure. A security assessment, or what we call physical security assessments, or PSAs, or just it's an evaluation of existing security measures that protect assets. So someone comes in and they take a look at, number one, they determine what your threat is. And then number two, they're going to come in and they're going to evaluate the situation. Like, what are you doing and where are the vulnerabilities here? So very first thing is, hey, we need to identify what those critical assets are. And what that means is, what has a positive value to the house of worship? And if something bad were to happen, what does that mean? Second step in this is what we just talked about. A threat assessment needs to be done in that evaluation to tell you the threats or types of threats you guys are dealing with and what it is that you're trying to prevent. The vulnerability assessment, I mentioned that in the last part of this presentation, that those are the things that we're not doing that leave us open potentially to risk. And so the vulnerability assessment will cover what those opportunities are. And then, of course, there needs to be recommendations from the person that actually provides the assessment. And this is where training and certification, very specifically in assessments, risk assessments, threat assessments, vulnerability assessments, whatever, this is where this comes handy, right? So I want somebody that knows how to do this. And the assessment itself at the end should be a roadmap for your security planning. So it should tell you everything that you need to do from here forward. So the assessment is not just telling you what the threats are, what your vulnerabilities are, and what recommendations are, but it tells you what you need to do forward. So it's your roadmap. So again, it's not just an assessment, it's actually going to be your plan, if that makes sense. So we're going to get now into the violence piece. Okay, so when we start talking about intentional threats, or trying to prevent violence, like, what does that look like? So the very first thing, let's talk about categories of violence. So there are two categories of violence, very specifically effective and predatory. And our focus here, we're going to get into intentional threats because that's what we're trying to prevent. And that's a focus, and we're going to get into that. But when we look at violence in general, there are two categories, and we need to address both. And so the effective violence is going to be something, the best example is going to be like domestic violence, all right? So effective violence is mostly emotional, okay? So it's a reaction to something. So this might be a domestic situation. You've got someone in the congregation that's maybe they're separated, they're going through a divorce, they show up together, and then something is said, there is some emotional confrontation, involved, and someone does something in reaction to some sort of response. So we look at stuff domestic assaults, threats are made. So that's effective. After the act of violence is committed, A lot of times afterward, someone is remorseful about what happened. So that's effective violence. And we do need to address things like domestic assault or the potential of that happening in the church because separations, divorce, and then just emotional confrontations happen in churches. People have disagreements. And so that's effective violence. That's the first type or category. And that does need to be addressed in the security plan and training for our teams. And then when we start talking about intentional threats, that's the predatory stuff. Predatory violence is very intended. It is planned. It's premeditated. And when we get into things like active assailants, people that commit arson, vandalism, criminal acts, that's predatory in nature. Those most of the time, those acts, very specifically the active assailants, they are always going to be predatory violence, and that's what we're looking for because we can see signs for those, and we're going to get into that when we start talking about behavior threat detection here in just a minute. Now, the early detection and prevention piece for this gets into the behavior piece. This is how we're going to use our personnel, which we'll get into, to see things early and to prevent them. All right. So the first step in our preventative measures, especially when we start talking about intended violence or predatory violence, is we develop a pattern analysis, or we figure out what that is. So what is supposed to happen, right? So what am I looking for? What is the security team looking for every Sunday and every Wednesday night, whenever you guys are getting together for worship or some sort of an event? So what's supposed to happen, what's not? Now, once we understand that, then we implement, we talked about this in the threat piece, and we start talking about attacks, then we implement the layered response. So we need our folks to be at the different layers or locations, in our protective space or our protected area to be able to detect these things. And what they're looking for is that anomaly or something that is not supposed to happen, right? And then, of course, we get into once the anomaly is spotted, then we get into the observation, reporting, and then, of course, addressing potentially those threats. So this is the early detection piece, the behavior piece of what that looks like. And you guys can join in. We've got some comprehensive videos on our Israeli security concept and behavior threat detection piece. And anytime if you guys have a question, all you have to do is send me an email at contact@michaelmannsecurityservices.com, and I'll be glad to answer those questions for you. But this is how we detect those very specifically, those intended threats early, and how we prevent them from occurring. Okay. So let's get into the role of law enforcement, because some of you guys may be using police officers now. What does that look like for the church? Okay. So law enforcement response, just understand there are two types of responses. There's immediate and delayed. Now, again, some of you folks may be using like uniformed police officers now. Maybe you're using those folks for security. Maybe you're using them just for traffic control. Maybe you're using them for special events. And that's awesome if you have the resources to do it. A lot of churches do not, or house of worship don't have the ability to do that. They're just going to call the police if something happens. And so when we start talking about that, we get into the response piece, right? Things that we do to try to neutralize a threat, and that's what response means. And so there's immediate and delayed. Immediate means somebody is on site. They are there to respond to that undesirable event. Delayed is what a lot of churches may have to deal with if they're going to have to call 911 or they don't have a physical security response on site. And that means I call somebody, and then it's going to take some amount of time for that person to get there to deal with the problem. Now, understand, especially when we start talking about like active assailant events, over 80% of those events are over before the police or LEOs, law enforcement officers, arrive. And that's not the police officer's fault. There are some requirements from response, right? They have to get a notification. And the police officer themselves doesn't receive that notification. A communication center does. And then that communication center, once you call 911, has to determine what's going on, where this is happening, and then they have to dispatch the closest units. And then, of course, they've got to the officer has to receive that communication, and then they have to deploy to get there. So naturally, there's always going to be a delay when we start talking about if they're not on site. Also understand in police, like in law enforcement in the United States of America, because we live in a constitutional republic, we have a constitution, we have a Bill of Rights. The police are designed to be responsive in nature. And that's a great thing. Just understand the police have no legal requirement to protect any of us. We could call them and they never show up. There's not much we can do about that. And there are case studies out there that you can look at that prove that over and over. These are cases that came out of the 70s and 80s out of the Supreme Court. And then over the last, from the 90s all the way forward until current day, there have been other incidents that we use as case studies to show everybody that, hey, the police don't have to do anything. We live in this republic, and our constitutional republic, and it is designed for us to protect ourselves, and that's why the first 10 amendments are so important. Okay, just understand too, if we've got this delayed response, most of the time, from a law enforcement perspective, what this is mitigation. We're slowing down the impact of something. This, it's not when we start talking about response. If we don't have something immediate on site that can stop it immediately, what we're really doing is we're just mitigating this. So we're just slowing down or lessening the impact. That's all mitigation means. So if I don't have an immediate responder on site and I have to wait for that person, that's really the result that we're going to get. So just understand that it's going to be delayed if we call 911. And it's not their fault. They're going to have to get that communication. They're going to have to deploy there. They've never probably been to the site. Maybe they've never had to deal with this kind of stuff before. So that's another vulnerability. There are no legal requirements for the police to do any of this. And just understand what we're really doing is mitigating if we don't have an immediate responder on site. Okay. All right, so the last thing we're going to get into in these preventative measures, or understanding what they look like, is our safety functions. Like, what does this look like? Oh, so safety and security teams, what does this mean? So here's where we're trying to provide an immediate response that is on site. So your immediate responders, people that are there that not only, now they're going to provide an immediate response to something undesirable, but if I have immediate responders on site and they're trained correctly, then they can prevent some of these events from occurring, and that is the goal. Now, we have two types of teams. We have volunteer teams and we have paid teams. Now, depending on how you have it set up, a lot of times, like when we talk about volunteers, obviously that's going to be your safety and security volunteer team. Those folks that we don't pay, it's part of a service to the church. They step forward because that's how they want to serve. And that's an awesome thing. I'm a big pro safety and security, especially when I start talking about volunteers that want to serve the church. I love it. That's what the majority of our business does: provides, trains them, implements them, writes the plans for those types of functions. When we get into paid immediate or responders, we would get into like maybe staff members. If your church is big enough or has the resources, you might have a person that's on staff, the church does, that actually provides maybe it's a full or a part-time security function where they are paid and they are there. And so part of their job would be to respond during one of these services. Some churches have the resources to do that. The majority do not. So that's one paid function. And then, of course, you can also use contract security. And that's where we transfer the risk, or the church transfers the risk, and then they bring in a third-party vendor that is going to provide contract security personnel. And depending on what state you're in Tennessee, those folks can be plain clothes or uniform. Some states restrict that, but here in Tennessee, that is not restricted. So it just depends on the laws, depends on your security plan, and really what the church wants, what that looks like. Okay. Now, whether it is paid, volunteer, contract staff, whatever, doesn't matter. The requirements are there needs to be management. So there needs to be a dedicated leader. Going back to the volunteer stuff, folks, one of the biggest opportunities I see with volunteer security teams is trying to implement some sort of a manager or leader that is dedicated to running or managing the function of that volunteer security team. So there's always a lack of someone managing it, whether it's a staff member of the church or whether that's a volunteer that steps forward and says, hey, I'm willing to put 10 to 20 hours a week into this. And a lot of times I'll just kind of a warning order for you guys. If you're looking at putting a safety and security function in, especially with volunteers, if somebody's going to lead it, even if it's a small function, if you've got a training requirement, if there's a plan in place, that volunteer leader needs to plan on a minimum of probably 10 hours a week of being involved in the management and leadership side of it. That's a minimum. There's a lot that goes into managing these folks, especially if you have a plan and they're trained and it's comprehensive. There needs to be training requirements. I know it's tough to train volunteers. I train dozens of churches and volunteers throughout the country every year. And one of the biggest opportunities they have is trying to get people to sign up for the training, to attend the training, to go out and implement what they are learned in that, what they are taught in that training or what they learn in the training. That's a big opportunity, and there's a gap there. But just understand, no matter how small or how comprehensive, if you've got volunteers that are serving, there needs to be some sort of training requirement implemented prior to those folks standing post. Whether or not the state requires that or not really doesn't matter. They need to have some sort of standard for two reasons. So they know what to do, number one. So there's a plan and they know how to implement and execute that plan. Number two, it provides a standard. And in general, as human beings, we want standards. We are designed to follow. Now we follow the wrong things, unfortunately, because we are sinful, because we live in a Genesis 3:15 world. We live in this fallen world, but understand we do want a standard. And so the training provides a standard, okay? And so number one, it's a plan, right? So they know what to do. They can execute the plan. Number two, it's a standard. And number three, with that standard, because we want that, that actually can lead people to the safety and security function. It can make people motivated or motivate them to come on board if you have a standard. A lot of times what I see is if there's not a standard or a good standard, that's the big opportunity for people that are trying to get volunteers to recruit them and they can't. It's because there's not a standard in place, and that's what folks are looking for. And then, of course, the final thing is environment and culture. Whatever this is, paid, volunteer, contract staff, doesn't matter. That function needs to fit into the environment and culture of the house of worship. If it does not, then you're going to have a high rate of failure. So this is not TSA. We're not going to the airport. We're not patting people down. We're not running through metal detectors. Guys, I would say if you're having to put those type of measures in at your church, especially during your standard worship services, especially at the Christian churches. Now, I work with a lot of Jewish houses of worship where the threats are different. The intended threats, because of their just because of threat characteristics, at times can be different. But I'm speaking to the Christian churches here, folks. During basic worship services or our standard worship services, if we're going to put metal detectors in and pat people down, couple things: either the risk is really, really high, and man, maybe we need to find out a different way to protect those assets and do church service a little bit different. Or two, what does your threat assessment say? Are those measures required to address the threats in the threat assessment? And if you had an assessment that includes a threat assessment that tells you what the threats are. So just some questions to think about if we've got these really heavy physical protection requirements in place. And it makes it look like it's, TSA at the airport or some sort of a, high risk facility. What's your threat assessment say? And are we addressing that correctly? And is your threat assessment correct? Is the threat assessment an assumption based on what someone told you or told the church? So those are good questions to ask when we start talking about, man, what does environment and culture look like? And does our security function fit into that? All right, folks. That's it. Again, if you want to contact me, you give me a contact at michaelmannsecurityservices.com, or you can call me at 615-956-3912. And remember, folks, it's about prevention, not response.